And the Berlin Society of Kaisers, the militarised society as it then was, simply didn't understand it. They voted to close the exhibition within 1 week, and this caused an absolute uproar. This was in the Art Union of Berlin, a very prestigious place to exhibit. But he was noticed by the avant-garde, by art dealers of the time, who offered to circulate his paintings around Germany. But more importantly, he stayed in the city and made use of superlative printmakers, which he was not accustomed to. He came from Christiania, was very small, it was on the edge of Europe. He did not have the opportunity to express and play around with these techniques in the way that he could when he got to Berlin. So quite quickly he then achieved fame because his paintings were now on tour, but he took up making these prints in this incredible way with printmakers in the city in Berlin.
It's bound to be a very, very popular exhibition, and those 5 years that you've worked on it have been astonishing in creating the quality of what you've got in there, and these 45 prints, which is a very, we haven't had that level of detail on Munch's work for a very long time. But it's a very shocking and deeply disturbing exhibition, isn't it? And these images of the dead mother or the woman who's given birth, she's had syphilis and she's given birth, are still shocking today. I mean, can you account for that?
I think that's exactly what Munch was trying to do. He was trying to create a subjective feeling, an emotional impact, which people of any age, of any period, could key into. At the time, they were particularly relevant. He was a man of the moment. He represented events and emotions that were going on with family and friends around him and society. Syphilis was a huge fear. Tuberculosis was the biggest problem. But many people were fearful of syphilis. Indeed, it struck Nietzsche, who he much admired, Frederick Delius, the English composer who he knew well, also suffered and died eventually from syphilis. And these were the ills of today. But Munch essentially wasn't a political artist at all. These emotions he wanted to key into, he felt he could draw simply from his own experience. And that was what he worked really hard at. The technological achievements of printmaking techniques, particularly lithography and woodcut in Paris and Berlin of this period, were superlative and were critical to Munch's impact at this time. So in many ways he was a man of his moment. He took full advantage of the technological achievements of the printmaking mediums and then took them one step further, used the materiality of the blocks, texture of the stone to reproduce and reiterate these themes in colour and in different moods, which could really pull in and make you even more attuned to what he was trying to do, what he was trying to represent.
What do you think he really meant by this infinite scream through nature?
I think he was representing a moment of inner turmoil himself. What set that up, or why, what created it, we simply don't know. That's left for interpretation. But he does say he wasn't feeling well when he went on that walk. So we all know that feeling. If we're not feeling too great and you go out for a walk, anything really could set it off. Well, with Munch, it was the sight of particularly red, unusual clouds. He said the sky turned red, but blood red, like coagulated blood. And he stressed this on a number of times. The artist he recounted this tale to, they were on holiday in Nice at the time, south of France, told him to get on with it and paint the scene because it was clearly bothering him. He kept repeating it and going over it to his friend. So I think it was the combination of those red clouds and not feeling well, just somehow created a feeling of intense anxiety within him, which he then interpreted visually, which is what he was best at and what he was developing in terms of these wavy lines, as though the whole of nature was moving. It was sort of like a waving, I equate it to a tuning fork almost going through that body, as though his whole body was screaming, feeling the effect of that scream that was passing through him. But I think we're dealing with a psychological state here. I don't think he was necessarily hearing anything.
How important is this exhibition for the British Museum and to have the funding to do this extraordinary event?
This exhibition is a major achievement for us at the museum because Munch's work is really little known in the UK, and it's terribly important to see these things in their original. Munch today is well known through books and reproduction, but I feel that actually, as a man, he and his society, where he lived, who he met, the culture he was involved of and part of, is little understood. It's Europe of the 1890s, essentially, before the First World War, which was an exciting place to live. Electricity was just being used in entertainment, in theatre. The Eiffel Tower had just been opened in 1889 in Paris at the World Fair. It was an incredible engineering achievement. There were advances were being made in science and technology. There were studies being made in hysteria, so-called, this affliction of women. Well, Munch's response to that, in a way, is himself screaming. So it's not just women who were afflicted in this way. He had a big understanding of, I think, of inner turmoil. His own sister was diagnosed with schizophrenia in the mid-1890s and incarcerated, and he cared for her, sent money home to care for her until her death. So it is important to position Munch as a major master printmaker in the collection, national collection of graphic art here in London. And we are one of the biggest collections in the world. And I think Munch himself would have been thrilled to have been positioned with Dürer, Rembrandt and Goya, which is how he saw his prints. To put on an exhibition like this, we do need sponsors. Yes, it is important to gain sponsorship and funding. The Norwegians have been very generous. They're very, very keen to promote Munch outside Norway, and they're also very, very keen to encourage visitors to go to Norway. So it's a happy coincidence in a way. But all exhibitions of this type need funding. Otherwise, you can't stage it in the way that you want it. You need to spend a lot of time on the design, the interpretation. I made the selection, but then I worked very closely with the designer for quite some time to work a way of how we could present it, so that the works shone through, and that there was enough light and the kind of backdrop, things that you don't really look at when you go to an exhibition, but they do make a huge difference, and they cost money like everything else. So it's very important to get sponsors lined up at the outset for something like this.
What do you think is the value to cultural London of putting on an exhibition like this, both for international visitors to keep our brand up abroad post-Brexit, that we can actually do these sort of things, and for our own education and cultural value?
Well, I think anybody seeing these images by Munch will be sucked into just not only understanding a man going through the same turbulent emotions in another period, but also just these subjects he presents are eternal. They're always going to be there. And I think anybody can get release from your own problems in society by going back and looking in time at how it affected somebody else. There's always something sort of rather cathartic about that. You might be having a bad moment. Well, look and see how it must have been and felt for Munch being in that family with all those deaths and no prospect of being able to heal them, and how the impact that would have had on him himself. So I think, when you can learn and engage with a different part of society to your own, it not only improves your own perspective on life, but it helps. I think it reorientates your own position on your view of society today. You can see things in perspective, and that sense of history is that we've all been there, we've all done that. But it does help to get a wider picture of where Munch was in who he knew, what the culture and society were like. In primarily we're looking at Paris and Berlin and Christianity. So we have worked quite hard to give you a feeling of what those cities were like. What it was like for everybody, not just what they looked like, what it must have felt like going to Paris from Oslo, which was so cold, And he writes, he talks about the warmth and the sunshine. He writes back to his aunt, Karen, and says, it's wonderful here. Spring has arrived. That makes quite an impact from, coming from the frozen north, as it were. So.
Do you think the fierceness of the industrialisation of cities really hit him compared to the quietness of his home life?
I think it must have made some impact, but remember this was going on all through many major cities throughout the 19th century in Europe. Christiania itself was beginning to, it had a burgeoning shipbuilding industry. People were coming in from more rural areas and trying to find work, but it was still a solid bourgeois, deeply, deeply Lutheran society. And I think going to somewhere like Berlin, where there's massive building exercises, and indeed Paris, where there was so much excitement and it was the centre of the art world for him, it must have made a huge impact. And that sense of travel and freedom must have been, really quite cathartic and energising for him.
But it's the prints that are important in this exhibition. Giulia, do you think that we still underestimate the value of prints and print exhibitions?
I think we certainly do. It's always very difficult to highlight the importance of prints and printmaking techniques until you actually put them on display. And then I'm always startled by people saying, oh, I hadn't realised it was as big as that, or that it was, the detail is so incredible. The detail of the difference, for instance, between the wood grain showing through in Vampire, the contrast between that and the texture of the stone, which you see because he makes this complicated technique of combining woodcut lithography, is only really properly seen when you look at the print, the original print in the flesh, in the raw. Reproductions just don't work in the same way, and you've got a single unified format if you're looking in a book. You just don't get the same impact, and I don't think just knowing the image is not enough to really position the importance of these prints and how Munch viewed them himself. On his 75th birthday, we see him posing in his studio at Eckerley, surrounded by those images of his early life, the frieze of life, which he attached so much importance to him. Right next to him is a portfolio of prints. That's been positioned there. He's got almost his hand is near it to convey the importance that the medium of lithography and woodcut had to him.